Right now, somewhere in Afghanistan, a farmer is making less than $2 a day growing a flower. By the time that flower reaches a street corner in Chicago or London or Sydney, it has been marked up hundreds of times over. No legal commodity on earth does that. Not gold, not oil, not diamonds. This is the supply chain of heroin, and it runs more efficiently than most Fortune 500 companies. But here's what nobody actually tells you about heroin. It isn't a story about addiction first. It's a story about economics, about geography, about what happens when a product has infinite demand, zero regulation, and a supply chain that has survived empires, wars, and the entire combined intelligence apparatus of the Western world. So let's follow the chain, every single link, from the soil it grows in to the vein it ends up in. It starts with a poppy, Papaver somniferum, a remarkably beautiful plant that happens to produce one of the most chemically complex substances in nature. When you score the unripe seed pod with a small blade, a milky white latex bleeds out. That latex, raw opium, contains morphine, codeine, and dozens of other alkaloids that interact directly with the human brain's pain and pleasure receptors. Around 1804, a German pharmacist named Friedrich Sertiner isolated morphine from raw opium, naming it after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. Then, in 1898, Bayer, yes, the same Bayer that makes your aspirin, synthesized diacetylmorphine and marketed it commercially as a non-addictive alternative to morphine for respiratory illness. They called it heroin, from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic, because test subjects reported feeling invincible. Bayer sold it in bottles, over the counter. That product is now the subject of a global black market estimated at over $50 billion a year. Now, back to that field. Afghanistan produces approximately 80 to 90% of the world's illicit opium, not occasionally, consistently. For decades. This isn't an accident of nature. Afghanistan's Helmand province has ideal soil, altitude, and climate for poppy cultivation. But more importantly, it has something no legal crop can compete with: a guaranteed buyer, a guaranteed price, and no taxation. For an Afghan farmer living on degraded land with no irrigation infrastructure and no access to stable markets, growing food crops earns a fraction of what poppy earns per acre. Growing poppy earns several times more than any food crop available to them. That's not a choice. That's arithmetic. And here's the part that should disturb you. During the 20-year American military presence in Afghanistan, the longest war in U.S. history, opium production didn't decrease, it increased. In 2001, the Taliban had reduced cultivation by roughly 90% through religious prohibition, enforced extremely harshly. After the invasion, production exploded. By 2017, Afghanistan was producing a record 9,000 metric tons of opium, according to the UN ODC Afghanistan Opium Survey. When the Taliban returned to power in 2021 and banned poppy cultivation again, UNODC satellite monitoring confirmed approximately a 95% reduction in cultivation by 2023. Under the American military presence, opium production reached record levels, a fact that no official report has been able to fully explain away. So the opium leaves the farm. Where does it go? This is where the supply chain gets interesting, and where it starts to look less like crime and more like logistics. Raw opium is collected and transported to processing labs, usually inside Afghanistan or just across the border in Pakistan or Iran. Here, the opium is chemically processed into morphine base, a step that reduces the weight by roughly 10 to 1, making it far easier to smuggle. Then, with acetic anhydride, a legal industrial chemical used primarily in textile and pharmaceutical manufacturing, the morphine base is converted into heroin. This chemical reaction takes roughly 12 hours and produces a product 2 to 3 times more potent than morphine. The acetic anhydride itself tells its own story. It's manufactured legally in Europe, China, and India for entirely legitimate industrial purposes, but a significant portion is consistently diverted into the heroin supply chain. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has tracked this diversion for decades. A chemical that serves legitimate industry is also the essential ingredient in the world's most destructive drug supply chain. From the labs The heroin moves. And here's where geography becomes destiny. There are three primary trafficking routes out of Afghanistan. The Balkan route runs through Iran, Turkey, and into Europe, historically the most established corridor, responsible for the majority of heroin reaching Western Europe. The northern route goes through Central Asia into Russia, and the southern route moves through Pakistan toward maritime networks that distribute product to Africa, Southeast Asia, and eventually the Americas. Each route is controlled not by a single cartel, but by a fractured ecosystem of trafficking networks. Afghan smugglers hand off to Iranian networks. Iranian networks hand off to Turkish organized crime groups. By the time heroin crosses into Europe, it may have changed hands 4 or 5 times. Each handoff increases the price. Each handoff adds a layer of insulation between the origin and the destination. This is deliberate. It makes prosecution nearly impossible because no single actor holds the full chain. By the time heroin reaches a major European distribution hub, Rotterdam, the largest port in Europe by cargo volume, the wholesale price per kilogram has risen dramatically from what was paid at the Afghan farm gate, and it hasn't even reached the street yet. At this stage, the heroin is cut, diluted, mixed with lactose, paracetamol, or quinine. And in recent years, this is where it becomes truly lethal. Fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid approximately 100 times more potent than morphine. It's cheap, it's odorless, and it stretches product volume dramatically. The problem is that a fatal dose for a non-tolerant person can be measured in milligrams, an amount invisible to the naked eye. When dealers cut heroin with fentanyl inconsistently, the result is a batch where one hit contains a recreational dose and the next contains a fatal one. This is why overdose statistics in the United States escalated catastrophically from around 2016 onward. It's not that users became less careful, it's that the product became chemically unpredictable. And here's what ties this entire chain together, the part that's sitting in plain sight but nobody wants to say directly. Every link in this chain exists because of prohibition, not despite it, because of it. When you make a product illegal, you don't eliminate demand, you eliminate regulation. You hand pricing power, quality control, and distribution infrastructure to the most ruthless actors available. The farmer plants because there's no viable alternative. The trafficker moves because the margin is extraordinary. The dealer cuts because volume means survival. And somewhere at the end of this chain, a person uses because their brain, after enough exposure, has been chemically restructured to need it. The supply chain of heroin isn't chaos, it's a market, a brutally rational one. And until the people making policy are honest about that, it will keep running more efficiently than most Fortune 500 companies.